Hi, and welcome to this special edition of the 2026 Rare Disease Day podcast. My name is Claudia Filosof, Vice President and a Pathology Therapeutic Area Head at Fortrea. I've spent the past 20 years in clinical development, working with sponsors to design efficient programs that deliver high-quality data and, most importantly, meaningful therapies for patients with high unmet needs. Throughout my career, I've been a strong advocate for bringing the patient perspective into clinical development. The patient voice is now central to how science, regulators, and sponsors work together, and I'm honored to host this podcast focused on that critical topic.
Sclerosis cholangitis is a rare, progressive cholestatic liver disease marked by diagnostic delays, lack of approved therapies, and significant unmet needs, making it emblematic of the broader challenges that patients faced with rare diseases. Rare Disease Day was first launched in 2008 by the Eurortis group and was created precisely to bring visibility to conditions like PSC that are too often overlooked or insufficient understood. It's held annually on the last day of February, including February 29th in leap years, the rarest date of the year. This day symbolizes the unique challenges that individuals with rare diseases face. What began as a European initiative has since grown as a global movement, including now more than 100 countries. Today, as we focus specifically on PSC, its burden, and the scientific and advocacy efforts shaping the future of care, we are honored to welcome two distinguished leaders in this space. We have the honor of hosting Steve Rossi, Chief Scientific Officer for PSC Partners Seeking a Cure in the U.S. Steve oversees their patient-centered research initiatives and research grant programs. Prior to joining PSC Partners, he spent 25 years in the biotech industry developing new drugs for liver diseases, including a PSC program. We are also privileged to be joined by Martine Wormsley, a PSC patient herself, and the head of research and policy at PSC Support in UK, whose leadership and lived experience continue to influence advocacy, research directions, and policy efforts aimed at improving outcomes for patients living with PSC. Together, their perspectives embody the very mission of Rare Disease Day, uniting science, advocacy, and lived experience to drive meaningful change for individuals affected by this rare disease. Thank you very much, Steve and Martine, for joining. I have a first question, and I guess that patients, when they get the diagnosis, they face several challenges. Can you share with us what these challenges are?
Yes, thank you, Claudia. So it can take a long time to get diagnosed with PSC. Often patients present to their doctor with vague symptoms like pain or fatigue. And unless you know what you're looking for as a doctor, it's difficult to diagnose. So it can take a long time. And we often call this in rare disease the fact that patients go on a diagnostic odyssey. And for me, I got diagnosed when I lived in a different country, and my daughter was about 9 months old. And my doctor sat me down and said, "Martine, I'm so sorry, you've got primary sclerosing cholangitis. You need to go home back to the UK to be with your family." I thought, what does that mean? That sounds serious. So obviously I went back home, worked out how to spell PSC, and did a Google. And Google told me I had 5 years to live. It was devastating because I thought that my daughter might not grow up with a mother and that I might not see my daughter grow up. And that was 18 years ago. So we packed up and we came back to the UK. But I'm still here. and I'm doing really, really well, which wasn't what Google told me. But what I didn't know then was that PSC doesn't progress in a linear fashion. It can be up and down, fast and slow for different people. So the actual diagnosis itself was a challenge for me in the way it was delivered.
Thank you. Steve, can you share your perspective?
Yeah, well, Martine brings up a very key issue of what happens up to the patient's diagnosis and the time it can take to get there. But the challenges actually still continue after the diagnosis, not just because of the lack of linearity, but most patients are not connected to a hepatologist. If they're lucky, they live somewhere nearby, but a good portion of patients are actually trying to get access to a specialist, and that can take a long time. Many patients are seen by an IBD specialist because there's about an 80% overlap there. But they're focused on their IBD care, and the PSC often takes a back seat to their IBD. So finding the ways that patients can get connected to somebody with a liver specialty focused on their PSC, communicating the right information to them, getting all the procedures set up to make sure their quality of life and their outcomes are as optimized as possible, continues to be a challenge. But this is also where I think our two organizations are really trying to help bridge that.
Yeah, and then this is going to be my next question. What other actions? What are the real actions that your organizations are doing to help patients during this period?
So, like Steve said, I think the patient organisations are a vital bridge between getting that diagnosis and getting the care that they need. At PSC Support, we provide information that's been fact-checked by specialists, and it's evidence-based and free to access for patients. We have a helpline, online forums. We have face-to-face information days for patients where they can come and meet someone else with PSC for the first time. And that's really important because when you've got a rare disease, not only does your doctor probably only have one patient with PSC, but you're likely not to ever meet anyone with PSC unless you go to a specific conference or information day. We hold regular online webinars where patients can ask questions about their disease and their care. And we also have an app where patients can track their symptoms and help manage their appointments and ask the right questions. And I think what we're doing is we're empowering patients to be experts in their own condition, and that improves care. But also what that means is that patients are better informed and they're more ready and able to engage in clinical trials when they come along.
Yep. And, our activities mirror a lot of what PSA Support does. And I would say both sites have incredible websites that really provide an extensive amount of information that the patients can access. And I think we have both very aligned clinical information between the two websites, but then there's also a great way that there's sort of country-specific information as well that's very important to the patients. In addition to kind of what PSC Support is doing, we actually have a provider map because we don't have a centralized healthcare system. It's a little more difficult to navigate, so patients can try to connect to a specialist. We do Zoom rooms and mentor programs, so similar to what Martine said, getting somebody connected to another patient is so key to just bring the realities of what the likelihood of progressing is and putting it into context for them. We do an annual conference, so we don't do as many information days. We do webinars, but we do a very large international, it's largely targeted at the US, but we get people from all over the world. Over 300 people actually attended last year, patients and providers. We have a unique registry also that is a place where patients can actually sign up and provide their medical information, and it's another way for them to feel they're contributing and also exchange information as well. And this year we're starting 3 connected to care summits. So in 3 large areas where there really isn't a good support system for PSC, for clinical and research. LA, Chicago, and New York, believe it or not, do not have good infrastructures for care and connection for patients. So we're trying to do some regional work as well, similar to kind of what Martine's group does for the information days as well. We have a bigger area to stretch across.
And it's important. I have a rare disease myself, a different one, but this interaction with other patients, they can learn themselves, right? Because sometimes there are areas where they are not specialists, and the patients know more about the disease than some of the physicians that they are visiting. And well, in this specific rare disease, the patients have to deal with the situation of lack of approved therapies. And are the patients willing to participate in clinical trials?
Yeah. So it's interesting, after many years, finally, the guidelines actually recommend, both AASLD and EASL recommend that all patients should be approached to participate in a clinical trial that is appropriate for them, but there should at least be options. But we did a survey a few years ago of close to 1,000 patients, and only 25% had been actually approached about a trial, and less than 5% had participated. And I know Martine's group did a similar survey and came up with about the same percentages, so it's pretty accurate. The reasons why are largely what we talked about already, is that most of the study sites are specialists, and the patients don't have access to the study sites. So I think we'll address some of that down the line about how we might be able to improve that. But I think, unfortunately, the majority of patients aren't getting access to clinical trials at this point.
Okay.
This is true. And once they know about the trials, they're very willing to go on them. I mean, if you've got a disease, we've had PSC around for 160 years. So, it's been around a long time, but we've still got no treatment, nothing to stop progression. And when you've got an incurable disease with daily debilitating symptoms and an increased risk of aggressive cancers, you are highly motivated to be interested in research and looking to taking part in clinical trials. We've got people with PSC of all ages dying early, and we need the treatments urgently. In fact, we need them yesterday. So patients are really, really keen to get on trials once they know about them. But it is a major challenge helping them find out about the trials.
And how you create awareness, how you can facilitate this information to patients.
So we've PSC support's got quite a few different ways of trying to inform patients about clinical trials, and we take it really seriously. On our website, we've got an interactive map, so you can click on it and you can see which study sites are going to be near you, where you live, and it also gives information about that trial. And you can search for trials that are looking at specific things. So there might be a trial looking at controlling certain symptoms or slowing progression of the disease, and you can filter for those particular trials to see which one you might want to go on. And we've tried over the years to standardize the information we've got about clinical trials, so that when patients are looking, they're almost comparing different trials and comparing similar things, so that hopefully one day, when there's enough trials, they can choose which ones they want to take part in. We also have a special sign-up form on our website for the really major trials, like the aspirin PSC trial in the UK, where you can sign up for updates for when a site opens near you. So that particular study has got 30 or 40 different sites opening at various times in 2025 and 26. And another thing that we do to help raise awareness about trials is not only telling them about when trials are open for recruitment, but sharing results of trials. Like PSC Partners do this really well as well, because patients are really hungry for information. So we're really keen to be telling them about the trials all along their cycle.
Yep. I think, similar to Martine, on our website, we have a page and we're actually updating, so a lot more filtering can be done by country, by state, even by phase of study, so that patients, there's some education around what are the different phases. So there's a little awareness as to kind of what they might be participating in. We do lots of education about trials and basically news alerts, even press releases that we've done when new trial results happen or when a new trial is being announced. Something we've been collaborating very closely with the pharma companies on this is our registry, which has about 2,500 patients in it, allows us with a firewall to reach out to patients, just our organization, not any of the companies. And we can send a survey out with the key inclusion-exclusion criteria, and it allows patients to potentially connect and get more information about the study. So there's actually some targeted ways through the registry we've been doing that, and it's been helpful. But any chance we can advertise about a new therapy, a new study, any sort of education around that, it always becomes one of the most popular things that patients engage with. So it gets to what Martine's saying is when the information's there, patients connect to it and want to be connected to it.
Yeah, I think the PSC Partners Registry is one of the most important things, actually, because if we had every single patient in the world signed up to the PSC Partners Registry, everybody could be told about trials as and when they're opening and what's relevant to them. And that's what patients want.
Yep.
Yeah. Sounds as a great initiative to identify and to somehow to reach to a channel to reach the patients to inform about the clinical trial. And patients also seem to have interest based on what you have just described. What are the barriers? What barriers do you use to observe that are preventing patients from participating or having interest in participating in a trial?
No. Well, having spent 25 years on the biotech side and seeing the mistakes that we made when we were designing studies, you get together with all the scientists and clinicians, and they come up with the best study possible, and we're going to study everything and get every test, and we're going to understand everything about PSC. And then you actually have a patient come in and they either are being asked to do a biopsy, potentially getting an MRCP, coming back for a colonoscopy if they haven't had it, getting a barrage of blood tests, and 10 PROs that they're all going to fill out on a baseline visit. And so I think that the biggest challenge have been the just kind of not taking patient practicality and trying to stay focused as best as you can on finding that balance of doing good research and understanding the burden, and frankly, the burden on both the sites and the patients in sometimes over-designing a clinical trial. And that turns patients off, or if they feel it's too much of a burden, like everything that they've got to do, they'll read this and they just go, no, thank you. I don't, they won't even consent for it many times. But Martine, your perspective.
I think burden's the word. There's almost an invisible burden for a PSC patient taking part in a clinical trial. And it's all around like the logistical and psychological barriers. So first of all, we're rare, so we're geographically dispersed. So that means that it might be that a patient who wants to go on a trial has to travel several hours to get to the trial site. That's a challenge, especially when you think about the typical patient that might be going on a trial. They're 30 to 40 years old. They're holding down a full-time job. They've got a family. So getting to a clinical trial appointment on a Wednesday afternoon might not be very easy for them. So that can certainly be a barrier. Another barrier is what Steve alluded to earlier. Like 25% of patients are approached for clinical trials. So that means 3/4 are not. But there's a kind of a knowledge gap because patients assume they're going to be approached to go on a trial if they're eligible. And that's not the case. Patients need to be proactive, hence the registry and websites where we're telling people about trials. And then the final barrier, I think, is the psychological one. There is a unknown, there's a fear of risks of taking the risk. There are unknown risks associated with taking an unknown drug and a fear of those risks. And it's a big deal to go on a clinical trial for a patient and something they have to think about very carefully before agreeing to do it.
Yeah. And I think the informed consent process, you see it done completely differently at many sites. And it really, when there is a connection to the patient and the patient feels they've been given the right information, they understand the risks, they're not just reading a 10-page consent document and, maybe asking a few questions, but it's a dialogue. The patient goes in with so much more comfort and trust. And they'll be more likely to stay in the trial, too, if they really feel like they have a good communication and connection to the site and the coordinators especially, but also the investigators.
Absolutely. And yes, Martine, please go ahead.
I was going to say, again, I think that's where the patient organisations come in again. All we're trying to do is normalise going on a clinical trial and making it something that's an everyday thing for patients, so that when they see a consent form, it's not some sea of complicated words and strange clauses. They know what's normal and what's not, and then they can make a better and more informed decision to take part.
Absolutely. And this is a basic rule. What you have just described, basic rule in drug development in general, right? So trying to simplify and trying to take into consideration that we are dealing with patients and not subjects. And sometimes we get, the sponsors get KOL feedback, and one KOL adds one assessment and the second another one and the third another one. And we all want to and sometimes the sponsor want to have everything without taking into consideration that we are dealing with patients. These are very, very valid and important points that you are bringing today. And what advice could you give to sponsors to facilitate enrollment, but not only enrollment, retention, right? Because it's if a patient is enrolled and then cannot stay in the study, drop out, it's a problem. So what type of advice could you give to sponsors?
Yeah. Claudia, I think you've seen this, having watched trials for many years, but sponsors, especially sponsors who are new to PSC, tend to roll over the same enrollment criteria, thinking that's what the FDA wants sometimes. So you start to see the same things over and over. And there are lessons learned along the way from each trial of how enrollment criteria can be improved to not have what we saw at some point, which was when we did 3 programs and we were having close to 80% screen fail rates. So when you look at, for example, alkaline phosphatase for years was something that was set as a threshold. And despite the advances, it was the largest reason why, if you didn't have a sufficiently elevated alk phos, we lost patients that were perfectly qualified for trials. And what we've learned with PSC versus, for example, PBC is that the alk phos isn't as critical of an indicator of disease. It varies much more. And so you can have patients who are perfectly qualified, and by moving that off the plate, suddenly a whole new group of patients is open. And we're seeing that now, but it takes a while for people to get comfortable to change. But I think it's really up to the sponsors to think about that and learn from the screen fails and things that maintain what the regulators want, but still can do good work. And then I think, we have these tight study windows, and it just makes it so tough for some patients. Some things have to be really tight, but I think there has to be some discussions around the flexibility on some of that for certain things, procedures in particular, where we stack 3 procedures up on a patient. It becomes more challenging. So these are just a few things that are more in the weeds from a study, but I think Martine's got some other thoughts as well.
Yeah, we're just going back to the alkaline phosphatase. There's been trials that I've wanted to go on, and I've been excluded because my ALP phos was too good, which is slightly frustrating because I wanted to take part.
Yeah.
But what are our patients saying? What they're telling us is they want to see, where possible, study visits being conducted at their home or place of work, so doing home visits. And actually 62% of our community, when we asked them, said that would increase the likelihood of them joining a clinical trial. And again, that goes back to people not living near the trial sites. And they'd like to see more digital tools. So instead of giving people a bunch of papers to do quality of life measures and so on, do it electronically. And I think that would make it easy for patients, and maybe they could do it the night before the study visit. Like Steve said, flexible study visit windows. That Wednesday afternoon meeting shouldn't be the reason someone can't take part in a trial. So if there's a slightly bigger window, they could, or maybe even weekend slots or evening slots, that would really help patients stay in trials. And then I think the final thing is the communication. PSC patients are really switched on and are interested in research. And when we've asked them what would stop you going on a trial, some of them are saying it's the mechanism of action of the drug itself, or we want to know exactly what it's going to be doing. So they're really sophisticated in terms of the information they want about trials. And I think it's really important to give that to them and explain it in a way that they can understand. And then if you can do that, you're designing the trials to fit into the reality of a patient's life, and that can only improve recruitment and retention.
Yeah. I mean, for years, Claudia, patients have been pushing for telehealth, remote visits, and for many years, sponsors were like, nope, can't do it. And one big thing changed that is COVID. And so suddenly we've figured out ways to do this. And it's not every visit. You can't have them completely disconnected. But integrating telehealth and remote visits in some capacity, especially for studies like some of the PSC ones that could be 3 to 5 years long, it really is going to be important to figure out how do you fit day-to-day life, because most PSC patients that are candidates for trials, they're not super early, they're not super sick because of exclusion criteria. They're in that sweet spot where they're living a pretty stable life with their disease. And so you have to figure out how do you work that into the trial, but also the fact you want people to have a normal life as best as possible too.
Mm-hmm. Well, the patient perspective is gaining increasing interest, having patients now having a critical role and even participating in conferences, right? But what do you think? Do you think that the patient's perspectives and real needs are currently being considered at the level that we are expecting, that you are expecting, or is there room for improvement? What are your recommendations to bring the patient perspective and needs to move to the next stage?
Well, you're right. Research that's been shaped by patients is definitely going to lead to better quality studies and be more relevant to patients. And it's not just a nice to have, it's absolutely critical. I think things are improving, but I think that the most effective way to integrate patient views is to engage early. And by early, we mean right at the beginning, not after the protocol's been signed, right at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah. And I think you're seeing too, both the regulators and grant agencies are actually becoming much more almost requiring that there is some patient feedback or that patient-focused, so the FDA does patient-focused drug development forums where it's really trying to elevate that the patient voice and what is really important to the patients is part of the prioritization of how trials and what drugs are being developed. Also, patients are frequently part of the advisory committees in various ways that the regulators are looking at this. But it's also, I think, the patient voice is becoming much more powerful. And this is important when we think about Rare Disease Day, is that for all rare diseases, the patient voice is pushing for access to care. and continuing to escalate, and has been influential in some rare diseases in making decisions as to whether a drug actually gets approved or not. So the patient voice continues to elevate. But I think it's important too that both of our organizations are not just a voice. We're actually very strong research organizations with both Martine's and my role. Martine, maybe talk about some of the research activities you guys are supporting there.
Yeah, so we both fund research and support research. And at PSC Support in the UK, we've got what we call a patient panel. And this is a group of 50 patients that are really interested in research. And we meet regularly to support academic and commercial researchers. And we arrange focus groups for them to advise on certain things. And that can be trial feasibility, just identifying those hurdles and barriers we talked about earlier that might prevent or reduce recruitment. The panels talk about endpoints and help select endpoints, and that might be from identifying which are the best PRO prompts to use, or it might be saying actual biological endpoints. It might be choosing those as well. Patients are really interested in what the research is trying to do. And the other thing that the patient panels do is get involved in the plain English summaries, all the patient-facing materials, making sure that they make sense and that people can actually understand them. And again, we encourage people to engage with us early so that we can bring the patient panel in and even comment on protocol design of studies if it's a clinical trial, so that patients are effectively pressure testing the design of the study. And I think that really helps.
Yeah. I mean, the review of the protocol is actually something how I got connected to PSC Partners when I was running a PSC study, because I came from an HIV background where you didn't do anything without checking with the patient advocates. That hasn't been so much the case in liver disease, but when I connected to PSC Partners, they were shocked I was asking them why, and it's because I wanted my trial to be, focused on what patients would actually do. We have we're doing some of the same things with Martine in terms of supporting grants, but PSC Partners is taking a strong role in actually leading and conducting research. So we're collaborating on developing 3 PROs for pain, fatigue, and liver pain with Dr. Donna Yvonne at University of North Carolina, and these are being developed as regulatory quality tools. We have our International Collaborative Research Network, which brings patients and experts together to focus on what is a patient prioritized project. We're funding Jesus Benalis and his team on early detection of cholangiocarcinoma, and Martina and I are part of the study team with that. And then the WIND project, which is actually a patient-led observational cohort that is meant to be supporting, hopefully, eventually accelerated approval or other types of drug development. But this is a global study, and the organization is actually running and funding it, as opposed to just being an advisor. So you're seeing this more and more, that patient-centered and patient-led research from the organizations is becoming something that's actually happening and important.
Very interesting. And can you briefly share with us, in your opinion, what are the new developments in PSC that can be impactful to patients?
Yeah. I think after years, decades, and a laundry list of every drug that's been tried, be it IBD drugs, immunosuppression, drugs for PBC, we have a growing list of what hasn't worked. But we're finally, I think, turning the corner and starting to see actual treatments that may be disease modifiers or slowing the progression of disease. And there's a whole new wave of promising new treatments that are coming that the patients are very, if you want to say, excited about, but also, I think, encouraged. But they're also a little gun shy because we've had, over the last 5 to 10 years, some phase 3 studies that all looked great and then they got stopped. But I think we're entering a new generation of therapies. We have elafibranor, which is a PPAR that's going into phase 3, nebacetyg, which it looks like it may go to phase 3 as well. So having 2 phase 3 studies is actually encouraging. There's a wave of phase 1-2 studies that are coming. And then we actually have our first successful phase 3 study with Norco, which is the first time, even with a histology endpoint, that we've seen something that looks like it could get approved, albeit it brings a new challenge in that it's likely only going to be approved in Europe. So we'll see what happens when U.S. patients decide that they want to get their hands on it. It's usually the opposite. But those types of things, the disease modifiers are really just, the patients are just thrilled that companies are staying in and investing in PSC and that they care about it. But Martine, I know there's other things, especially for you as a patient, that there's...
We definitely need something to slow down the disease and stop it or even reverse it. That's absolutely. And when I was first diagnosed, there were no clinical trials. In fact, I think that Norco was still a mouse model in those days. So we have come a long way, and there's so much more going on now in terms of research, and that is exciting. But while we're trying to get to the point where everybody can be treated and the disease can be stopped in its tracks, we need to help people and their symptoms. People with PSC are living with daily debilitating symptoms like itch and fatigue. And if you're 30 to 40 years old, trying to hold down a full-time job, care for your family and so on, that becomes really, really difficult. So it's really important to be able to treat symptoms. But before you can treat symptoms, you need to be able to measure them properly. And that's what PSC Partners are doing such great work in. They're doing their funding and directing symptom assessment tools. And in the UK, we're funding a quality of life measure that's specific to PSC, because if you're going to improve quality of life and symptoms, you need to ask patients the right questions. And that's what we hope those will do.
Sure. Well, I would like to finalize bringing Martine's perspective as a patient. You have already shared with us how impactful the diagnosis was in your life, and the misinformation that you can get sometimes in the internet if you don't go to the right sources, right? What can you share with us some other key points in your patient journey that can where patients can feel identified, but also to inform all the people listening to us today how you deal with the situation living with PSC?
Well, I think we call PSC the black box of hepatology, and it's for good reason. And actually, when you're diagnosed, you begin your PSC journey, shall we say, in total darkness. It properly is a black box. You're given a diagnosis with a name you can't pronounce, let alone spell. You Google it. Then you get faced with a terrifying reality that there's no cure, no treatment, an increased risk of aggressive cancers that are hard to detect. And not only are they hard to detect, they mimic the disease itself. So it's the diagnosis of PSC is devastating. And for many, the only solution that can be offered is a liver transplant. And liver transplants today are in a world where there's not enough organs to be used for liver transplants. So you're not guaranteed to get a new liver. And even once you have a new liver, if you get a transplant, the disease comes back in a third of patients. So transplant isn't the solution, it's a temporary one. Dr. Pralat Trivedi in the UK calls PSC, he says it represents the greatest unmet need in liver medicine. And I think, and that's absolutely true. And I think the patient organisations are the bridge between that initial diagnostic shock and clinical trials. And the clinical trials are the things that offer patients their first real taste of hope. So the way I kind of deal with PSC is to work on, I want to be part of this solution. I want to help people help people take part in research and help research move along so that we can get to the point where we have a real treatment or a cure. I'm just sorry, I'm just babbling now.
You're fine. You're fine. No, but I would say, to add something maybe at the end too, one of the most important things on Rare Disease Day as we think about this is both of our organizations individually are very strong. We're probably two of the strongest patient organizations in our area. But the most important thing that can happen, and this is why you see both Martina and I sitting here, is the power of collaboration. And for rare diseases where there's so small populations and individual countries, the impact we can make when the organizations come together. We've been working on projects together. This is a good example, but there's other patient groups, and just bringing those voices together to a solidified kind of agenda and initiatives, it is really so key. And it represents something that I think is important as we think about rare diseases and Rare Disease Day.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much for dedicating this time to this discussion.
Thank you.
Most importantly, thank you very much for all the work that you do on a daily basis to help patients with this rare disease.
Thank you. Thank you.
For giving us the opportunity.